Hello world, my name is Austin. Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. This week we're going to be talking about the concept of biblical manhood. So if you missed the previous video on the beginnings and intro to gender roles, please go check that out. Click over here, go watch it, and then come back. Okay, you back? Let's get started. As always, with a giant concept like biblical masculinity, there are a couple things that we should keep in mind before we jump right in. The first thing we need to remember is that all the biblical texts were written with a male audience in mind, whether they were addressed to a specifically male audience or to a mixture of men and women. All of the biblical texts were written from within a patriarchal society, and therefore the men who were writing assumed that the men who were listening were the ones that were going to do the acting. Male readership is just assumed. That means that when we go looking for Bible verses about how to be a good man, we're not likely to stumble across very many that start, "And now this part is for the guys." We have to read in between the lines to get the meaning. For instance, when you read the rule in Leviticus that says that you shouldn't show partiality to someone in a legal case just because they may have power or prestige, that rule was written for men because at the time, men were the only ones that were allowed to be part of legal proceedings. The whole Bible is filled with rules and verses like this that were originally addressed to men, but now we see as gender neutral. There is one area, though, where we tend to find verses that are directed specifically towards men or women, and that is within the sphere of family life. In the Old Testament, there are specific verses that have to do with how to be a good son and brother, how to find a good wife, how to relate to that wife within marriage, and how to be a good father. Because of the sheer number of these texts in the Old Testament, you can tell that the measure of somebody's manliness had to do with how well they fit the roles of son, brother, father, and husband. This focus on the man's role in the family continued on in the New Testament, and we see most of the verses related to manhood in the epistles or letters. The thing that we have to keep in mind when we read these letters, though, is that they were written from within Greek and Roman society, which was incredibly patriarchal. Greek and Roman society was built on something called the household codes, which ensured that everybody in society knew what their place was and what they were supposed to do. Household codes are based on three pairs of relationships: the husband and wife pair, the parent and child pair, and the master and slave pair. In Greek and Roman society, the husband, the master, and the parent had all of the power and agency, while the wife, the child, and the slave had virtually none. But the Greeks and Romans believed that these relationships were the pillars of their society, and if people didn't act according to their role in society, all heck would break loose. This is why in the New Testament we find the household codes written about positively and even championed, because people thought that society couldn't get by without them. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, we read that a man who would like to lead in the church must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? Early Christians began to use the household codes as formulas for other relationships, like the relationship between Christ and the church. Ephesians 5, verses 23 through 24 say, "For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. And just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything subject to their husbands." Some modern-day theologians believe that these kind of power structures, where men are supposed to be the active power and women are supposed to be the subjective support, should still be normative for us today. This kind of theology is called complementarianism, or complimentarity. Complementarians believe that the Bible mandates different but complementary roles for men and women in the church and in society. Some complementarians believe in the hierarchy of genders, where men are supposed to be the rulers and women are supposed to be subservient, but not all do. Some just believe that we are biologically destined for different roles. Personally, I find all kinds of problems with complementarity because there's no space within it for transgender or gender nonconforming or agender people. It is a system that is based on the binary. So if we can't use the Greek and Roman social gender norms as a model for us today, and if we can't exist with integrity as transgender people within complementarity, how do those of us who identify as male learn what it is to be a good man? This is an ongoing question for me as I study the Bible both by myself and in community. So far, there are two places that I go to for help. The first is the book of Proverbs, much of which is written as if from a father to a son. Proverbs contains advice about marriage, courtship, friendships, business, and just about everything else. Some of what it talks about is general, but a lot of it is specific. And of course, the second place I go for a model of biblical manhood is Jesus. The great thing about Jesus, though, is that we're all called to be Christ-like, regardless of our gender. And even more than that, Jesus didn't fit into the gender norm of his time, as the Gospels don't tell us that he ever had kids or was married. Still, Jesus knew what it was like to be a son, and it was his identity in relationship to God that defined him. When those of us who identify as male strive to live a Christ-like life, we are called both into and beyond our gender. And when we define ourselves through our active relationship to God, we become more than good men, we become good people, which is probably more important. Thanks for watching the video this week, everybody, and you can tune back in next week for a discussion on biblical womanhood. If you'd like to know more about gender in the Bible, this week's official resource is James Brownson's book, The Bible, Gender, and Sexuality, and I will link it down here in the description. All right, we'll see you back here next week. Peace.